Our Galatians passage this morning is a particularly well-known one. And I wouldn't be surprised if you've been asked to memorize it at some point in your life. I think it was just last week that during the benediction I rattled off a number of these fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. But this morning we have an opportunity to step back and look at the whole passage in its context, to receive it not just as marks of individual spiritual growth or righteousness, but more holistically as pro-social disciplines in the building up of community. And that's exactly where I want to draw your attention this morning, to a deeper understanding of these fruits of the Spirit, that they're less about you than they are about us. Now, Paul opens with a strong claim that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ has brought freedom. But freedom from what? Well, traditionally, we go to two primary liberations: freedom from sin and freedom from the law. What unites both of those fetters, those chains, those handcuffs, as their primary characteristic is that they have damaged or destroyed relationships. Sin has damaged humanity's relationship with God. The law, presented in the scriptures as a good and beautiful thing originally that was intended to help God's people live as the chosen ones, in our inability to actually keep the law, it just further condemned us. That's one of Paul's main points throughout all of his writings. Moreover, many people used the law as a tool to do violence within the community, to subvert what was meant to be a good and liberating thing into a vehicle of self-harm and the condemnation of other people. You remember, that's what Paul used to do back when he was called Saul, and he was a persecutor of the church. He was using the law to harm people. So here's an example from Matthew 12. You may be familiar with this story. It appears in multiple of the Gospels. But there's one day, the Pharisees accused Jesus and the disciples of breaking the Sabbath. The group had been walking by some fields, and it turned out the disciples were kind of hungry, and so even though it was on the Sabbath day, they began to pick some heads of grain, and they began to eat them. And the Pharisees, who were following Jesus around, trying to find any infraction of the law that they could use to condemn him, they said, "Ha! Gotcha! Look, your disciples, they're doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Now Jesus, he responds in that story by going back to events in the Hebrew Bible to show where there are these moments when people do break the law, they don't observe the law in times of genuine need, and yet it seems to be okay. And his primary example is a time when David, King David, but this was before he was the king, but when David was on the run because King Saul was chasing him, was hunting him down. And on one particular occasion, David and his friends, they sneak into the tabernacle and they eat the consecrated bread that was meant only for the priests. Now, David wasn't condemned. Even though he wasn't supposed to do that, he wasn't condemned for this infraction. And in fact, he went on to be crowned king. And that's what Jesus points to in that story and says, see, David did this and it was okay. And his point there is that clearly God is gracious to those in need. And that's what Jesus seems to be conveying further. He goes on to quote Hosea, the prophet, who shares the word of God to the people. And this is what Hosea said: "I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings," which is to say, God far prefers genuine acknowledgement, genuine relationship, genuine connection, a friendship. It's about a relationship more than it is about just following rules. It's not about an empty and dead rule following just for the sake of self-righteousness. Now, this same event, where Jesus and the disciples are accused of breaking the Sabbath, it also appears in the second chapter of Mark. And There, Jesus is credited with adding another line, another teaching, a very important one, and this is what he says there. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. With this one line, he is summing up the whole problem with the law and how it has come to be distorted. According to Dr. Nate Stuckey from Princeton Theological Seminary, the Sabbath was intended as a gift, not as a burden, but as a gift. It's an expression of God's grace. We don't have to work 24/7 in order to survive, thank God. And even back in Jesus' day, even without all the technology that we benefit from today that makes our lives so much easier and frees up so much of our time, even back then there was still time to rest. To experience the fullness of life, we can't work all the time. And yet so many of us today still have a distorted relationship to work. Alarmingly, as Stuckey found when interviewing dozens of high school students for his book, he writes, while confessing the desire to rest, these students also confessed that rest created its own anxiety. These industrious, capable, achieving students longed for rest, he writes. But when they stopped to rest, they found themselves thinking of all the things that aren't getting done. What a heartbreaking reality to long for rest and find only anxiety when you enter that rest. Now, this reality shouldn't sound foreign to us here in the river towns. Here we overschedule our children to the exclusion of rest, to the point of exhaustion. In the desire to create high achievers who will succeed in high-paced environments, we subtly educate them into panicked patience, what Dr. Stuckey was talking about, this inability to slow down because it feels like in any momentary pause, an opportunity has been lost, one which might never be recovered. And this is the kind of environment in which the Sabbath, as it was intended, should be recognized as a gift, as God's gift, not as a rule to be enforced. I'm not giving you fuel for a diatribe about how Sunday sports games are crowding out church. That is not my point here. The Sabbath is not a rule to be enforced, but a gift to be received. And in this case, our first priority should be the health and well-being of our overscheduled children. And this is exactly to Jesus' point. It's the point he's making to the Pharisees when he says that the Sabbath was made for man, for humanity, and not the other way around. The Sabbath was given to us as a gift that was meant to make our lives better. It wasn't given as a rule that was meant to condemn us when we break it. The Pharisees were fixated on whether a rule or tradition had been broken, rather than prioritizing attentiveness to the needs of the people. The disciples were hungry. They ate, and according to Jesus, it was good. To return to our Galatians passage, armed with this detour through the Sabbath, this is exactly what Paul is speaking about when he says, for freedom, Christ has set us free. What sort of freedom is this? What is this freedom from sin and freedom from slavery to the law? That law that has become a millstone around our neck, a heavy weight dragging us down and harming us, rather than being put to its proper purpose, to grind food, to provide sustenance, to put an end to hunger. That's what a millstone is supposed to do. So it is that Christian freedom should always be exercised in the building up of community and care for those in need. Freedom here rejects the excesses of American libertarianism or anarchism on the other side. Those are a freedom from communal responsibility. That's not what Paul's talking about here. This is not a freedom from communal responsibility. It's quite the opposite, quite the contrary. It's a freedom to charity, to mercy and solidarity. This is what Paul means when he says, do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence. but through love become servants to one another. Christian freedom is not about self. It's not about me and everything I get to do because I have freedom. It is rather an opportunity to really consider what is good in the eyes of God, what will build up the people around us, to apprehend the genuine spirit of the law as it was originally intended and act on it. Here's an example to return to that image of the grain field in a different way. I'm sure at some point you've heard about the tragedy of the commons. Have you heard about the tragedy of the commons? It's a principle that goes back hundreds of years that says if too many people are given unfettered, unrestricted access to a common, finite, limited, valuable resource, such as a pasture, or in this case, a field of grain, they will tend to overuse it and may end up destroying that common good altogether. Here's a very real example of how this works in our church context. I'm going to talk about the conference budget for about 10 seconds. Every committee has this tendency to say, well, I know I already reached my budget, but I mean, if I go over $100 in the budget, is that really going to make a big difference? Well, probably not. If our guys in history were to spend $6,000 and 100 extra, I don't think anybody would notice. The problem comes if every single committee does that. And conversely, if we have our churches that say, well, they won't notice if we just pay $100 short on our shared giving. Well, probably not. If just one church is short $100, that's probably not a big deal. But if every church is short $100 and every committee is $100 over budget, all of a sudden that delta between how much money we're spending and how much money we're collecting has grown rather large. And it didn't happen because any particular person was conniving or trying to do something, wrong. It's just everybody took a little bit more than was their fair share. And everybody just didn't quite give as much as they were supposed to. And those small differences add up in a way that impacts all of us in a much bigger way. That's an example of what the tragedy of the commons can look like. And so when we're faced with situations like that, there's only a couple of options in order to try to deal with that situation. One, there either needs to be some sort of governing body that moderates access to the field, that decides who is going to get to go into the field or who's not going to get to go into the field and when. Or, in economic theory, you might privatize the field. So only one person or one family gets to access that field. That's how we can stop this tragedy from happening. If everybody just has their own field instead of sharing one, then people will be more responsible. Don't worry, I'm going to critique all of these in a minute. But the third way that you deal with this, the third way that you can share an important common resource without slipping into this problem is everyone who's involved has to learn, they have to develop the wherewithal to self-govern by exercising voluntary restraint. We have to actually say, no, I'm not going to go $100 over my budget. In fact, you know what? I'm going to stay $100 under the budget. And in fact, I'm not going to withhold $100 from the share giving. I'm going to go above and beyond and give a little bit more. That's that spirit. If everyone can avoid that temptation and just take a little bit more than is needed, then the whole tragedy can be avoided. Now, when using this tragedy of the commons to think through the story about Sabbath I've referenced, it's as if the Pharisees have tried to set themselves up as that governing body that gets to tell everybody what to do, that HOA and Jesus is coming in and saying, go mind your own business. Thank you very much. In their love of rules, they've lost sight of the true purpose of the Sabbath and the true purpose of that field to be a good thing that everyone can have access to. Now, regarding that second option, the privatization, I would suggest to you that the Bible strongly pushes back against the full privatization of resources, such as in Leviticus 23, verse 22, which reads, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field." It means leave some unharvested. And don't gather all the gleanings in from the harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. It means if you've got a field, you should leave a whole section of it just unharvested for poor people and foreigners, immigrants, to come and take what food they need from this field. It's as if every private field, at least of a part of it, belongs to the community. Now, this gleaning on the edges is precisely what Jesus and the disciples are doing in that story that I've shared with you. But, of course, and this is important, that isn't to say that they should just take more than is appropriate. And so it is in Galatians that Paul is offering us an example of this third way, this Christian way, this way to share resources, to be in community in a way that even though we've been freed from a law and we've told the Pharisees to stop trying to monitor us and tell us what to do, we are in fact choosing self-restriction, self-governance, to avoid self-indulgence through the power of our faith. Be wary if you bite and devour one another, he says. Take care that you are not consumed by one another. That's a powerful metaphor of precisely this tragedy of the commons that I'm saying, where everyone takes a little bit more, and all of a sudden we've consumed everything, and in fact we're consuming each other. We're fighting over resources. And I go into this at length because I think this is the context in which Paul goes on to denounce this self-indulgence of the flesh. And here he's naming those impulses within us that are fundamentally selfish, that encourage us to take that little bit more than is our fair share. It's not a moralistic denunciation of those actions he considers sinful. That wouldn't really make sense. After all, he's just told us that we've been freed from the law. And yet now he's telling us, but here's all this stuff that you shouldn't do. Right? So it's not being offered as a law necessarily. I would say to you, it's practical and pragmatic advice. He's naming those desires and actions that are self-centered in a way that can damage our community, that can damage our family and our friendship, that can drive wedges between neighbors. Behaviors that are self-harming or transactional, that take advantage of other people. Don't do them, he's saying. But instead, he's inviting us into a different way of being in community, a different way of relating to one another, not one that's driven by self-interest or greed, but instead it's the opposite. It's one where we're guided by the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are the virtues needed for a diverse group of free people who have been given freedom and a responsibility to build the kingdom of God. These are the virtues and the characteristics that are needed for this diverse community to be a people who can self-govern without scandalizing the cross, without eating each other alive, without taking common resources and totally consuming them in our self-indulgence. And so it is that Paul concludes that those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. We've learned to say no to ourselves when we're putting ourselves first. Instead, we live by the Spirit, so let us be guided by the Spirit. Now I've given you we've gone deep on this passage. I'm coming to a close, right? But what I'm suggesting to you this morning is that this passage is not moralistic so much as it is pragmatic. It's not individual so much as it is communal. It's not anarchistic so much as it's about public service. It's not judgmental so much as it is invitational. And freedom. We have been called upon to exercise a higher public witness, a higher devotion, not only to God, but to care for all those around us, all of those in our community, everybody whose lives intersect with us. Not just our friends and families, but everyone who might possibly be considered our neighbors. And that's precisely why we skipped over it. At the very beginning of the passage, Paul leads off telling us the whole of the law is summed up in one single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. May it be so.